What a day. For a know-it-all like me, it's really almost embarrassing to say I learned so much today. It's amazing. And my name is Nick Allard. I used to be somebody. I was the president and dean of Wippman Law School, so there are quite a few old friends here, or longtime friends, I should say. Now I'm the founding dean, which is a different at the Jacksonville University College of Law at Jacksonville, Florida. And we're very proud. We've been going for 3 years. And we got accreditation faster than it's ever had. Initial accreditation I'm required to study. And it's all going great. What a privilege to be here. So I'll start off the housekeeping before we get into the substance. That is, if you want your CLE, make sure you sign out when you leave. It's kind of dangerous opening a program by talking about leaving, but when you leave, sign out to get the credit. Okay. We're starting a little early, so I appreciate everybody who's here, and what a day. So first, I want to please join me. I might interrupt myself. I do just think we all should express some thanks to the wonderful students and the servers and the food and event people and the security team. They have been really extraordinary. And for all of us who put on events all the time, this was a Class A production. We're really, really good. I was so thrilled and flattered that a long time friend through thick and Patty Salkin invited me be part of this program. And it's really humbling because I saw what came before, and I happen to know you all should be excited. This is not the icing on the cake at the end of the day. This is the cake that you're going to be eating. Able presidents of institutions who all have their JDs. It's going to be a terrific program if I ever stop talking. But what I wanted to start with was just two things that are on my mind. And one is, as I was about to get on the plane, fly here in the strange land south of Georgia, I had a phone call from a reporter, want to know if I could talk to him. I'm going to talk about the U.S. code, U.S. flag code, the U.S. flag code. And, it kind of hit me out of left field. I really didn't have any idea what he was talking about. I didn't know anything about this. Maybe some of you followed this, but he wanted me to come in and help decipher the legal issues surrounding some of the Southern governors, well, not some of the governors, including Governor of Florida, who want to have the U.S. flag fly full mast rather than half mast in honor of President Jimmy Carter. Given that there's a 30-day period, usually of observation, the flag is flown at half mast for the fallen president. The reason I mentioned this is because all the issues that we were talking about today, that you're hearing about, all the issues that all of us in higher education are dealing with, they're so difficult and they're so fraught, they're so emotional. And this just hit me as being, really, this is the world we're living in and dealing with. And it's not easy. It's not easy because this just hit me sort of as found such a smallness, such a short-sightedness and meanness we don't need. It's not contributing to any particular thing. And so I just wanted to share that to demonstrate an appreciation of the difficulty, what this is really all about today. Yes, last night is about leading these very difficult times. And the cultural and political business is just one part of it. I mean, we're not even talking about the rapid change. The only constant, paradoxically, in our lives is accelerating continuous change. Think about that. And that's why adaptability is so important. That's why all the leaders were talking about it. The second thing I just mentioned here is context. This is by way of a compliment to all of you, and certainly this panel here, is on that day and right now, and while I was trying to listen very carefully, I've been working on the American Bar Association's next traveling exhibit, which will be 2 years, not 1 year, an exhibit that travels through civic places, universities, and it's produced and put together by the Standing Committee on the Law Library of Congress, which I've been involved with. And I'm working on this exhibit to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the signing Declaration of Independence. And the course of getting that ready for the opening panels on this traveling exhibit. By the way, if anybody, we've had them at Jacksonville, we've had them at Brooklyn, state houses and law schools have them. They're very educational. The public likes to have them. Of course, I'm happy to, if you're interested in learning, very inexpensive, have them shipped to you and you can display them for a week or two or a month. You can own one. But the reason I bring this up is that in the course of pulling this all together, we realized of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence, 48% of them were lawyers. And something like 34 were lawyers. That's 48% of them. And it's a remarkable thing because we're trying to capture what it took and what was going on. And I'll tell you one thing that it took these lawyers who knew a thing or two, sign their names. They were signing their own death warrants. It took courage. And so as lawyers, we know that the watchwords of our profession as legal educators and as academic leaders, we're not only transmitting knowledge, generating and developing new knowledge. The watchwords are civility, courtesy, cooperation, but I think you have to add courage. So what you're going to hear today, and there are many examples already that we discussed about, is that being an outstanding academic leader requires courage. And for that, and that's why I raise this issue, it is to be commended for it, not to be taken for granted, especially in the present context, where the first time, perhaps in the history of the United States, where we can't take, it's not taken for granted, it's not taken as a given that higher education is valuable. We get away from that. It's useful for us all to defend, and that takes some courage in the present climate. Well, enough of that stuff. We have a remarkable panel, alphabetically. I am not going to, you have their detailed and very impressive CVs summarized in the material, so I pay your attention to them. I will just simply say that Andy Acebo, he is really remarkable in overcoming his disadvantage of not having been a law dean. Somehow managed, he seems to be people and influence. His native state of New Jersey. He's remarkable, and one of the things that he's particularly demonstrated incredible skill in doing and success in a short period of time. I don't want to say turnaround because that sounds deprecating, but he has solved in a very impressive way financial stress, financial challenges, including upgrading on Moody's and the ratings, which doesn't happen. You really.
I wish my
it's usually a one-way trip.
I wish the governor was here. Yeah.
The governor will be able to. Now, Michelle Anderson, President Anderson, president of, and I should have said Andy's president of New Jersey City University, but Michelle Anderson is the president of Brooklyn College. We knew each other, worked together very, very closely. She was very friendly, very helpful, very supportive. She was the dean at CUNY, which is a remarkable, unique school. Its emphasis on public service and serving the underserved stands out. And I was always jealous of their new facility to move into. Everybody, the only problem was that everybody always thought that Michelle was my boss. And I was the dean of Brooklyn Law School. She was Brooklyn, Brooklyn College's president. But that's okay because she's been so helpful to me always. And, most people didn't realize that Brooklyn College was an independent law school. But we're very happy. And we've been in close touch on so many issues. And I'm very, very grateful for the friendship, and leadership is remarkable. Nora Demleitner is president of not the Queen St. John's, but the unique, iconoclastic, distinctive St. John's. She is the, what do you call it? The combined, the national,
College-wide.
what the
College-wide.
college-wide of both locations in Annapolis and Santa Fe. And among many of its distinctive attributes, it's just a marvelous liberal arts institution. Its undergraduate curriculum education is based on a discussion of the great works. I've always wanted to do, but never had time to, but it's a good thing because I never would have understood it probably.
After the retirement that never comes, Nick. That's the thing.
Yeah, well, that's good because my retirement plan is death, right? And we'll see how that goes for me. Laura Ann Rosenbury, first woman, was the first woman dean of the University of Florida College of Law. She's the ninth president of Barnard. I will tell you, I was very, very disappointed. As soon as I became the dean in Florida, while she was the dean, was the first person to call me up and to welcome me, give me advice, had help. We talked about, I didn't have a library. We talked about that we should build a big one or look ahead and realize the libraries were going the other direction. Remember that? And then she left. She left, but she's up at Barnard, so I guess she's, has to answer to a higher authority right now. But there she is. We miss her, but it was just so good to see her. Seeing her very well. I think the word courage certainly applies to her. It was tough. I'm not telling you it was tough. I mean, I met my wife who's sitting here in middle school on the first day of school. And so I'm just not used to rejection. And it's taken me a while. I'm still a little bit. Okay, so those are pretty flaky and short introductions given their CVs and what they've accomplished.
David.
Mine was very short.
David, he is unforgettable. I think
This is what happens when you retire.
I think it's because I always wanted to go to Hamilton, but it was the one school that I didn't go to. He has the coolest title of anybody in the panel or in the room, anybody probably in the United States. He was president of Hamilton. He then became the president emeritus. Now he's the president in residence at Hamilton. And I guess that means that he sits around and has deep thoughts and then shares them with folks. But he's a very, very successful fellow, and he was the 20th president of Hamilton College. My apologies, David, but I forget, as Marla will tell you, I forget my own names was at the table. So it happens when you get to be my age. All right, now with those short introductions, now that I think I'm already complete, thanks for pointing that out. I mean, everybody is free to do that whenever I'm talking. By way of introduction, like everybody, we're not going to have everybody in the panel answer every question that we have for them. I'd like everybody in the panel everyone wants to know, why in the world did you want to be a college president? But before you answer that question, and try to be brief on this, like each of you, and we'll go right down, we'll start with Nora, is what were you doing immediately before you took the first step towards becoming academic leader and administrator? If it happened to be that your first time was the president, that even shortens the conversation. But what were you doing before you became an administrator, an academic leader? And then why did you become an academic president?
I was a law faculty member, and I don't think I fully appreciated how great the life of a law faculty member is. And then I became the academic dean. And I have to admit, at that point, I had two relatively small children still. Neither one slept for the whole first year. And then I didn't sleep for the whole first year of me being academic dean. I had no idea how difficult that was. I have to say, being a president is equally difficult, but at least now I can sleep. But it's really, I think, it was a pretty substantial step from being a law faculty member to the first administrative position.
So I was on the faculty at Villanova Law School, and I agree. I look back on those times and just remember them so fondly. People give you responsibility if you like responsibility and you like getting things done. And if that's happening to you, you should start thinking about yourself as a leader. People told me I should think about leadership. This was, I'm almost 9 years as president of Brooklyn College, as dean of CUNY Law. So this was some time ago. There were few women. Remain few women in leadership positions in law schools and in colleges. But I went to a panel with the great Judy Areen leading the. Wow, I'd never thought of that before, so I started to.
This question I usually answer laying on a couch and looking at the ceiling. I very obviously have an unorthodox path to the presidency. Joined New Jersey City University shortly in the midst, actually, of the pandemic, with the promise that the then longtime serving general counsel was looking towards retirement, and that could make a nice pathway for me, and what that could mean as being anchored in an institution that serves the community that I grew up in. My wife is an alum of the New Jersey City University. My mother-in-law is an alum. So I finally made them proud. I constantly get reminded that it took me longer to get accepted by New Jersey City University than it did them. But it was a perfect storm of sorts. About 9 months into my tenure at the university, the then president resigned after a faculty vote of no confidence. A fiscal exigency was declared, an acting president is named, and state controller investigations and everything you could imagine that I stood more in experience being an advocate than the executive up to that point. But the lessons, right, that I think you bring into even your legal education, that purpose crosses discipline, and seizing the opportunity to be a servant leader was something that I wasn't going to take for granted. New Jersey City University is New Jersey's oldest, longest standing minority serving, Hispanic serving institution. It serves a socioeconomically diverse student population, overwhelmingly first generation students that I get the privilege of crossing a campus and seeing my own personal story reflected right back at me. And so an opportunity to serve, coupled with I think being the weight of recognizing that leadership sometimes is thrusted upon you, not necessarily appointed, was important. And so all those factors, also recognizing the importance of not squandering the purpose of representation, was something that I took very seriously, of being able to articulate and execute a vision for where this institution was and revitalize it out of crisis was deeply personal to me. You'll read in my bio, our communications team emphasizes more than I'd like to. I'm still the only Latino leading a public university in the state of New Jersey. A lot is said about my age, right? Things that I can't control. Today happens to be my birthday. So, yeah. So as my wife, who tells everyone she also went to law school with me, would remind me, is that today the statute of limitation has run on the liability of my youth.
I got into higher education administration the old-fashioned way, completely by accident. I was sitting in my office at Cornell Law School, where I was on the faculty, doing what I usually did, which is look at my computer and hope that something interesting appeared on the screen, preferably written by me. And the phone rang, and it was the new president of Cornell, who the former law dean himself. And he said, look, I really want to expand the university's international profile and footprint. And I'm creating a new position, vice provost for international relations. You've had a lot of experience working internationally. Would you take this position? And not really knowing how to say no, which continues to be a problem, I said yes. And that's how I got into it. One brief amendment to Nick's description of my current role. I am a president in residence, but it's at Harvard, not at Hamilton. My successor at Hamilton probably would have found the other idea less appealing.
I practiced law in New York for 5 years before moving to Washington University in St. Louis to start teaching. And as almost right after I got tenure, the dean at WashU at the time asked me if I would be the vice dean. And I had a motto at that time of why not? So I said yes. And I realized even though I love teaching, I love scholarship, I had been missing out on the problem solving that I had been doing in legal practice before I joined academia. So unexpectedly, I really loved being a vice dean because of the problem solving aspect of it. And then I went on eventually to think about becoming a dean myself. It took a while. I didn't get the first job I applied for, but then I ended up at the University of Florida Levin College of Law in 2015. I was in my 8th year of that deanship when Barnard called looking for a new president. I was exhausted. Florida is an intense place, particularly leading a public law school. You know, COVID in Florida was very different than COVID here. But yet, the more I learned about Barnard, the more I realized that I had to put my hat in the ring. And I've been the president since June of 2023. So it's been a real whirlwind, given some of the issues we talked about earlier today.
Great. And they were all very crisp going through that. David, since I've got 2 goofs on your introduction, I'm trying for a third. I'm going to ask a question for you to kick off with, and then Nora and Laura address. Do this, put the other questions it up. So this question is, how has being a lawyer helped, and how has it hurt your work as
I think there are lots of ways being a lawyer has helped. And I would say also being a law dean has helped. As a law dean, you encounter most of the issues that you're likely to encounter as a president. You run a fairly independent school. You have your own admission staff. You do your own fundraising. You do your faculty appointment and promotion, you know, the general administration, the legal issues. A lot of those things are common to higher education administration. You don't have the 24/7, at least I didn't, the 24/7 atmosphere of a campus. We didn't have sports teams. Well, we had the Fighting Mondales, a hockey team. But other than that, you know, we didn't have fraternities and sororities. We didn't have concerts and, you know, students in residence. But many of the responsibilities are similar. As a lawyer, I think you learn to analyze problems carefully. You think critically. You do evidence-based decision-making. It's ingrained in us not only to consider alternative viewpoints, but to insist on hearing alternative viewpoints. So I think there are a lot of skills that are consistent with legal education that were very helpful to me. On the flip side, I think there were some disadvantages associated with it. For one, I came to Hamilton with a JD, not a PhD, which, you know, it took faculty a little while to get over that, not long. And sometimes, I think in my lawyerly analytical mode, I sometimes missed the larger and underlying human dimension of a problem. So as just one example, during COVID, we made a host of decisions, but one of them was to require vaccination. And we had a number of employees who really strongly did not want to get vaccinated, particularly in our facilities management group. So I went to meet with them, thinking, well, I will simply explain the case for vaccination, then we'll be clear and everyone will be happy and they'll go along. And I built a case as a lawyer might, and I talked about all the experts I had consulted and all the data I had reviewed and all the reports I had studied and why I believed that it was essential for the campus. And I could tell I was getting nowhere. And at the end of this, we had a lot of back and forth. And at the end, one employee stood up and he said, well, President Wippman, you've got your studies and I've got mine. And I got nowhere with them. So I think I didn't fully appreciate the underlying human dimension. And I should have approached it less as a legal argument and more as a what is really your concern? Let's see if there's a way we can work this out. I'm not sure we would have reached a different outcome, but it probably would have gone better.
So I fully agree in terms of the helpfulness of having been a law dean going into a presidency. I also think it matters a little bit which part of law you come from in terms of how you think about this. So I've always regretted that my background isn't in business law. My background is in criminal sentencing. So I, of course, will see a crime everywhere. I don't. But what I think I do, thinking about this often, is just I think about facts probably somewhat differently, and especially the question about how far back you go in order to kind of evaluate how a problem starts and really trying to get a full grasp of the situation. I think one of the most scary moments when I started as a president was when I had one of our staff members say to me, I don't understand why you're so nervous about risk and questions like that. We'll call the outside lawyer when we spot a legal problem. I don't have to tell you guys over there. That's what you're here for, to learn how to spot a legal problem. Now, these were people without any legal training. I think what they meant was Title IX, which some people seem to think the only law that governs higher ed is Title IX. And so that was kind of helpful to me to understand kind of what we actually needed to do to think about much more kind of exposure to law and to risk training. But it was also a little bit disconcerting as you're kind of thinking about all of this. I'd say there's another component in here that at least I have experienced was the gender piece. So I tend to approach things kind of rationally. That's what we're trained to do, logically. And my sense is that sometimes I at least need to remind myself that compassion and emotion will probably help me kind of with that closing that last piece of getting whatever we need to do. So rationality, I think, is great background training, but especially for a woman, I think there's still kind of the expectation that it's a little bit more of an emotional touch. So it's an important thing to think about.
And I agree with absolutely everything David and Nora have said. I'll emphasize two other things. To go to the issue of what type of law you practiced and how that might be relevant. When I was here in New York, I represented corporations accused of conduct. So I really focused a lot on what it meant to represent an entity. And then when I was teaching, I taught employment discrimination. And the students were so focused on the individual employees who were bringing the claims as opposed to the employers. And so, I spent a lot of time what the difference is an entity. That idea of what it means to represent and advocate for an entity was crucial for me as a law dean, and even more so as a president. And who do so there are all these different voices and stakeholders, but you're representing the entity. So your job is not to please everyone, not at all. You have to listen, but you have to know who do you report to? What does it mean to represent a college and the future of a college? The answers aren't always easy, but having that mindset of what it means to be moving an institution or an entity forward, as opposed to focusing on individuals, is something that I think lawyers particularly can do well, particularly if they have spent time focused on what it means to represent an entity. And then it's probably obvious, in the spring of 2023, I, for the 15th time, taught employment discrimination, which is primarily about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. After October 7th, 2023, so just 4 or 5 months later, all of a sudden, my whole life, it seemed, was Title VI. And the doctrine of Title VI is largely the same as Title VII. And so when I had faculty say, well, speech can never be harassment, that's something I had been teaching and writing about for 20 years. Who knew? I thought I was leaving law behind when I became the president of Barnard, but instead I did more law, at least last year, than I feel like I did.
Sometimes when we were in Florida, it felt like we were leaving law behind, So the next question I'm going to ask, Michelle, I'm asking, and this question is, are there any tips, and this is like a 3,000-foot level, general tips to approach, pick one, like a really difficult problem or challenge, in terms of how a college president, in general tips on how to tackle it. You can pass, but it gets more.
General tips for a challenging problem. Well, it's interesting because Laura talked about what it means to represent an institution and to know who you are supposed to respond to and who is your boss. And I wonder often who is my boss. Everyone is my boss as president of Brooklyn College. The legislature, the faculty, the students, the donors, the board. It's the number of people and I'm sure I've missed quite a few, who have a legitimate claim being my boss. They're not wrong. None of them are wrong. It's just challenging, I think, to be responsive to who your boss is as the leader of a complex institution. And also, I'm within CUNY, right? I have actual bosses, the chancellor of CUNY, the board of trustees of CUNY. I didn't even mention those, right? Because they're not as immediate in terms of the voices in my head on a day-to-day basis about how to make decisions for whom. Who do you represent, right? And what I think each of those individual constituents miss is this piece that I think is implicit in what Laura said, which is what's best for the institution, the life of the institution, the longevity, the reputation of the institution, independent of the disappointment of any number of stakeholders currently. And really challenging questions posed when you think about it that way, because it's partly about explaining. Well, first it's about taking everyone's input. That's one tip I would say. And I would say take it input, welcome it skeptically, because everyone will be convinced that everybody else is wrong about what you should do on a complex issue. And so you need to have skepticism about what people say you should be doing. And yeah, I think it's about listening and about weighing and about thinking about how different stakeholders see a problem, but then backing up and identifying what's best for the longevity, reputation, and excellence of this institution.
That's hard to follow.
Acebo has got an article that's going to appear on this issue. How did President Anderson do? I'm just kidding.
Well, I'm gonna have to have you my phone a friend at work. Yeah. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think I think sometimes we get wonky around policy and not enough attention to the fact that we're social and emotional beings. And I think leaning into the emotional connection to the constituencies and the stakeholders and those that are your actual bosses and those who perceive themselves to be your boss is important. I think something that we've done, and I've got some of my colleagues here over the last 2 years, is the recognition that the solution to the problem for many will pose a bigger problem. And knowing how to navigate that is particularly important. Giving folks an opportunity to be heard, but setting ground rules in the beginning, which is like, that doesn't necessarily mean that that dictates outcomes, right? Most people just want to be heard and want to see that your decision is reflective of that exchange, right? Maybe in typical Jersey fashion, I've learned that it's very hard to hate up close, right? So you bring maybe the disaffected within closer range when you have to make something that is perceived as a controversial decision. I think the lessons and the hallmarks of true leadership is not that you're seen, but that you're felt in the decisions that you make. Over the last year, everything that I spoke as briefly as I could about the challenges that led to my presidency, that basically created the pathway to even allow me to have the privilege to serve. All those things required being incredibly attentive to community and ensuring that while you may be the face of the organization, that means that you will maybe sometimes disproportionately get praised for the achievements and also disproportionately get the blame for when things don't go well. That centering yourself in human connection is critical to being successful as a leader of an entity, an organization with varied perspectives. And I think to conclude this is to bring a conclusion to successfully addressing a complex issue is to kind of dispel the notion of something being complex to begin with. Sometimes organizations make things more difficult than they actually are. We've found that sometimes it's the easy things that are made hard, right? Because you don't put the time to really connect with the individuals that will be most intimately affected. And we tend to sometimes make decisions disproportionately, again, by privileging critics that to sometimes espouse their opinions from the cheap seat.
Thank you. So one of the things that often happens when we're talking about, our constituents are talking about, regulators, lawmakers talk about all the one size fits all the issues, if they're all the same. And we have at the panel very broad range of different things. With respect to presidents or lawyers, and Nora is writing a piece that appear in the Touro Journal on some of these differences. Like actually the whole panel, try to be crisp because of what but still what are some of the differences for presidents who are lawyers? Colleges large and small, colleges that have in-house lawyers or only rely on not going to say the other word, out-house lawyers, and those kind of differences. What extent does that make a difference for a president who's a lawyer? All right, why don't you kick that off? We'll go right down the panel.
Happy to, Nick. So I'm at a relatively small but relatively complicated institution. We have 2 campuses. We're accredited with different accreditors. We have different tax ID numbers. We're in different states, so we're governed by different state laws. So we have a pretty complicated structure, and we only have about 1,100 students. So and we don't have an in-house lawyer. So we're working with outside counsel, but it's like a spot check that's been historically done at the institution. So our lawyers actually never looked, for example, at the whole of our governance documents. And one of the things that I realized is he has good insight, but not a full scope. So I've been trying to really work on changing that so that not that he functions like an in-house lawyer, that's asking way too much, but that he kind of really can advise and has a broader purview of what is actually happening at the institution. Of course, it's easier for me sometimes to talk to our outside lawyer, but I think it's also important that the senior team learns how to kind of relate with an outside lawyer and kind of understand how they function. I don't think you can expect all your constituents to do this, but my guess is we all have lawyers on our boards. So it certainly helps to kind of have that. At the same time, I think it's really important to think about yourself, not primarily as a lawyer. You're not the in-house lawyer, you're not the outside lawyer. You're really just someone who has legal training, and therefore they come with a certain background and a certain language and certain expectations. We had a faculty meeting yesterday where I had to laugh because our faculty is heavily on philosophers and humanities faculty. They were talking about problems that no lawyer would think about because we have rules, we have hierarchy of laws, right? We have first in time rules. We have all these kind of things. But if you're not coming from this area, this all looks very different. I think it's really important to keep that in mind, but also to have a full set of relationships with people in other fields, because you don't want to become too kind of one-sided or appear too one-sided to your team either. So I think it's really kind of checking yourself on how much you think like a lawyer versus how much you really think like a president who has that kind of a background. My suspicion is small institutions like right now are really struggling with the amount of laws. We heard this morning 296 federal. Well, that's specific to higher ed, right? Then there's this whole area of law that's not specific to higher ed. And then if you have a state legislature that's very interested in higher education, they have a whole host of laws that, if you're really lucky, are actually not in conflict, at least with federal law. So this makes it really complicated, and I think we'll see more struggles for presidents. And I think the reason that we're all here is because a lot of boards are at least subconsciously aware of these kind of challenges.
And that's just in a moose bouche, what'll be a great, widely read article, I'm sure. Since time is short, I'm going to tighten the question. Coming down, and that is, pick one difference you can think of, a difference between institutions where implications for a president and lawyer, large or small, public or private, in-house, not in-house, and just identify the one that we should give more thought to, something that would be a critical difference. If that question isn't clear, you can just pass.
Yeah. When I was dean of a law school, there was a lawyer who was the counsel to the law school, but had a very limited role. Was not, I didn't have any sense of what it meant to have a general counsel who, on a day-to-day basis, you would consult, or they would bring issues to you and you would confer. And maybe that was because it was law school. I'm not sure. Maybe it was idiosyncratic to that institution. When I became a college president and had someone said, this is my role. I am the counsel to the college, and we work on things together. It was brilliant. It was awesome. It was wonderful. I think I had to restrain myself from being too close to this person because we had so much for so many issues. And one of my counsel at the time is here, Sarah Luke, who is fantastic. I lost her to Brooklyn Law. But you know, it's a friendship and a kind of closeness intellectually as colleagues that you need to resist an impulse to be too close to that person. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to speak from just my vantage point of leading a regional public comprehensive as a lawyer who had just most recently served as the general counsel for that very institution that I now get to lead. there's a lot of self-checking that has to happen, right? That I have to remind myself that I'm not showing up pro se to my cabinet meetings, right? And really leaning on the fact that that the worst thing you could do is to still try to be the general counsel just because you understand the legal issues and you would advise a certain way, that you have to give the respect and deference to your leadership, right, in those ranks, to be able to reach independent thought and guidance. Um, uh, I do think though that in that space, right, you can't ever shed kind of the experience, professional or otherwise, that you bring to the role. And I think in the public regional comprehensive side, particularly when it's an institution that you're leading that is so embedded within community, the role of the lawyer president, I think, takes on a more nuanced perspective that I think we're infused with kind of skills and experience that allow us to be advocates, very loud public advocates for a mission. And the role that I think sometimes gets lost for institutional leaders is that you're also a steward of place, not just people. And to the extent that you find that balancing act, because it is a balance of not obfuscating kind of your knowledge and background, right? That informs and makes more robust dialogue with your in-house counsel or outside counsel, because they're, again, you're speaking the same language that maybe a non-lawyer wouldn't be as fluent in. Recognizing that your role and your experience as a legal practitioner helps elevate the role of your general counsel in conversations in ways that may not always be the case.
I think it was Tolstoy who said, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And I don't mean to suggest that colleges and universities are all unhappy, but whatever type of institution you're at, you've got your own challenges. So for some it's financial and it's existential. For others who, like Hamilton, which is a very well endowed school, we had to worry about things like an excise tax on our endowment earnings. We are worried about affirmative action or legacy admissions, which only affect highly selective institutions, or principally affect highly selective institutions. And we didn't have an in-house counsel's office, so a lot of these things I was trying to grapple with myself. When I was at the University of Minnesota, it's 66,000 students over 5 campuses. They had, 50 lawyers in the general counsel's office, but they also had a host of legal issues that we didn't have to deal with. They had their own campus police force, for example, which, raised all kinds of questions. So the size of the institution and the wealth of the institution, those things generate different issues, and it doesn't make it easier or less easier. It's just your own issues.
I absolutely agree. And to link it to the last panel, Barnard is an independent institution. We were founded in 1889 after Columbia repeatedly refused to admit women. Last school in the Ivy League to admit women. They did not admit women until 1983. So we've always been separate from Columbia, but starting in 1900, we entered into a contractual relationship. To link it to the last panel, we call it the intercorporate agreement. It's renewed every 10 years. It allows for the exchange of students across Broadway. So our students can take courses at Columbia. So it allows for students to use the libraries at both places, the dining halls. As part of the negotiations in 1983, when Columbia tried to acquire Barnard, solve their Title IX problem by giving them all of our female athletes. And we're now the only women's college in the states that gives students the opportunity to participate in Division I sports, because Columbia's Division I. That's part of the intercorporate agreement. Yeah. Every 10 years, this gets modified, renegotiated. Every now and then, Columbia threatens to blow it up or to acquire us. And so I started on June 12th, 2023, and the agreement had been in place for almost 10 years. It was expiring on June 30th, 2023. Thank God I had done a lot of negotiating and, and had my legal training, and also knew how to quickly deploy the lawyers on the board to help, because they could then talk to people on the Columbia board. So we were able to get the agreement renewed with some modifications. So that's a unique part of Barnard. Besides being a women's college, we have this relationship with Columbia. It means a lot of people think we're the same as Columbia, and that's been hard in this Title VI moment. But it's also provides real value to our students, and so having to look at both the good and some of the drawbacks of having that long-term, complicated contractual relationship.
Okay, so that little snapshot reveals the kaleidoscope, variety, different aspects and issues, and it demonstrates how complicated what we already thought applications are. Every institution is different. Leaders have to adjust. So you have a complicated, tough issue, give it to the lawyer. Not surprising. Now it's a speed round. We'll open it up to the audience. The speed round is, I'll start with you. All right. We'll just go the other way. Very quickly, choose one academic leader, past or present, you admire, the large number that you probably could, and very briefly why people should look into their background or why you admire them.
Ruth Simmons, former president of Smith, then of Brown, and then an HBCU in Texas, has a really wide view of a range of higher ed institutions, and recently published a book describing her trajectory. It's extremely powerful. I went to her for advice during the encampments at Columbia, but our students were participating in those encampments and were arrested as part of that. And she really helped me clarify my moral compass and helped me distill some of the hard decisions I had to make.
We knew Ruth pretty well when she was at Princeton, and the one word I would use to describe her is steady.
I'd cite Freeman Hrabowski, who was the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, transformed that institution over the course of 30 years from a fairly obscure regional institution into a leader in many ways, particularly in STEM education, was incredibly dedicated to his students and to higher education, is an inspirational speaker, speaks regularly at the New President's Workshop and other events for presidents, is a phenomenal speaker, but also just an incredibly decent human being. And when I was encountering some problems of my own related to managing the protests in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and I called him, and he, had no reason really to know who I was, but was incredibly helpful and thoughtful and devoted a lot of time to giving me really useful advice. So just a wonderful leader.
I was going to say Dr. Simmons also, but I'll change it. But I'll just anecdotally share that yes, my time at Brown, she was the president at the time, and sometimes they tell you don't meet your heroes because they'll disappoint you. Like, she's the exception to that. But equally up there for me would be Dr. Millie Garcia, the chancellor of the California State University system, someone that I think personifies the virtue of higher education and public higher education, particularly, as being indispensable to a civil society and a democracy, and what it means for mobility for our communities, for those that have been chronically and systematically, in many instances, marginalized and minoritized out of opportunity.
Yeah, I think Judith Areen was just a lion of leadership in a particular moment of time in Georgetown law's history, and just transformed that institution. I think Felix Matos Rodriguez, who's the head of CUNY, faces extraordinary challenges and does it with a kind of grace that is stunning. I say that not just because he's one of my many bosses, but also because I think I just feel a lot of empathy with him. He was the president of Queens College when I was at the law school. And so we were peers for so long. I feel like every challenge she faces, I wince and fear, along with him. So
Always annoys Judy Areen when I greet her and remind her that this is my property professor. I don't know why. All right.
I'll also make a pitch for looking at your own institution and seeing incredible people, but mine is somebody you've never heard of. He was a president at St. John's for 30 years. In the past, he has a not too exciting biography, but we have a lot of his letters. So I have actually seen some of the things he has written and how he's dealt with things. And what I would give him high marks on is vision. So we were one of the first institutions to not only admit, but graduate an African-American south of the Mason-Dixon line. He was the person who made a push to admit women, which makes me proud. Columbia took many more decades after us. He was the one who had then got the money to retrofit the whole campus to actually allow for women because there weren't many on campus at all. The faculty wasn't particularly female friendly either. And then he, with no money at the time, hired a renowned California architect, Richard Neutra, to build our main academic building. And you've looked at the times and looked at California's fires. One of the Neutra buildings over there, most of them are in the West, just burned down. So we really have now an architectural treasure on our campus. And so I have to say, he's also made some decisions I didn't agree with, but they were all visionary. And I really am just amazed how we look back in our institution's history and there are really people who made a major difference. And I'm always haunted by the question, in 30 years, is there going to be a president who will say, what was she thinking?
Well, that's a beautiful group of tributes. The point of personal privilege, I'm going to answer one of the questions. And I'm going to choose Patty Salk. And I really mean it. And as a Washington lawyer, former Washington lawyer who engaged in government relations and lobbying, am not above obsequious sucking up. So let me explain. Let me explain briefly. So, again, if you're in Washington, there's a saying, get a friend, get a dog. In higher education, especially in leadership, it's really great to have a friend. And Patty is a great friend. That's number one. And by the way, what makes it even more impressive is I know how many friends say that she's a friend and helpful, supportive, and makes the time when you don't have the time and answers the dumb question, responds late at night, or finds opportunities and helps people in myriad ways. She's a true friend. We're colleagues in the academy, and it's selfless, unrecognized service and a gift. I guess it would be called the highest kind of mitzvah because you do it when nobody else. Not bad for a Catholic ex-altar boy, huh? So that's that. Second is, she is made such an impact in so many different things and fields. So everybody thinks she's a leader in whatever activity they're in, whether it's New York State Bar Association or Women's Leadership Group, graduate schools, or legal education, or the bar. Our review got that change. The ABA put the change through. But across the board, she's making contribution so prodigious. It's like that fable of the blind men and the elephant. Everybody has a different piece, but nobody has the whole picture. And then the other thing is that she's a real pioneer and leader, but not both scholarship and teaching. On top of that, has a day job as a leading administrator. So she got, that book out there that's worth reading. Breakthrough book, and it identifies a lot of great doctoral dissertation research projects that should be pursued. That book was basically her PhD dissertation Who gets a PhD while they're the provost? I mean, who does that? So she's remarkable that I picked her, and she's an inspiration. If we ever have another energy crisis, you just plug into that. Problem will be solved. Okay. Do we have any time, or have we just consumed all the time? I'm sure there's some questions. Okay, we have some time. That's what I heard. If that's not what you said, I'll ignore it. Anybody have a question? I'm sure you do. If not, I got plenty more we didn't get to, so I'm sure you'd like to ask it. No question. Yes, Patty.
About a time when you get that result, but you step back in your plan, or you put it back, we go a different way, whether it's for treatment.
I'll take a stab at this. It happens more often than I care to admit. And I think it's not necessarily a tribute to personality quirks, but just of sometimes difference in approach, not necessarily outcome. I view the role, and I think because of my legal background representing entities, and I also began my career doing white collar defense and internal investigation. So there's a deep understanding of the lawyer for an organization as representing the institution and not individuals. So a lot of times, some of the fights or disagreements, I should say, more diplomatically with my general counsel, is having to remind her that I don't need her to defend me. Because the job is hard, right? And critics will come out of the woodwork. And I think the knee-jerk reaction sometimes when you are in the trenches with individuals and you're part of a team, that line gets blurred, right? Even the most ethical of practitioners, you see people's humanity up close, and there's this compulsion to like lean in and say, you're being wronged, right? The faculty's out of control. Like we push back against this. Me having to remind them, it's like, as a friend, I love you for that. But you don't represent me, you represent the institution.
Okay. Before we sing happy birthday to Andy, we have a question, thank God.
So it was fascinating to hear your approach. And I'll just echo what Dr. Allard said. The best part of my job is that Patty Sulkin is here as provost. So as attorneys, how do you deal with actions that might entail risk? Do you think that you're more risk averse than if you didn't have legal training, or do you feel more comfortable handling risks? Let's say you have a decision that you think is right for the institution, but there's a Title VI or Title IX question. Do you think your background as attorneys impacts the way you gauge risk in making decisions?
I think as attorneys, we think about, I suspect, we think about risks on both sides and the weighing those risks against one another. And we also think about risks in terms of appeal. So one of the things that is interesting about leadership is that you're sort of doing the same. Any challenge never goes away. It never fully goes away. It comes back as an appeal in some later fashion. It morphs, it comes back. And what I keep thinking about is, okay, a decision today, how does that a year from now morph and come back? And this is true whether or not you're talking about an external, media outlet that has it out for the college, or you're thinking about someone internally that you imagine their perspective will come back in another dialogue. But the thing about lawyers is that we think about appeal a lot, and how is this going to play on appeal? And I don't think that the issues we face come back again and again and again in different form.
I would add that my biggest conflicts with our in-house general counsel, we have a team of 4 and an excellent head of the team, is that she is more risk averse than I am. And so I'm glad I have her to be risk averse, so I can then be more risky. But the other way to frame your question is I inherited a culture that was, I would say, very ad hoc. There weren't a lot of procedures or systems or policies. And that alarmed me as a leader and a lawyer. And so setting what I now call a culture of compliance is one of my main priorities. And I don't know if that would be one of my main priorities if I wasn't a lawyer, but I can look ahead to see that if we don't have this system or process or policy in place, things are going to be really bad down the road. And I choose not to see that as risk averse, but maybe some people would view it as risk averse.
So I see everybody nodding their heads vigorously in agreement, maybe for the first time in this panel. But that is a very profound and important observation. And that is something that a lawyer president so often to get out the informality, the ad hocness established. Not a constraint, straitjacket, but a framework. Nora, you're itching to add something, I can see.
Yeah, and so was David, I noticed. I think what you see
I've
at
just been
smaller
ignoring you.
institutions, and I have to also say, he's now a board member, so he's really my boss. So I don't know how this is going to come back to me that I just cut him off here.
Okay.
So I think on smaller institutions, there's a lot of this, well, we're a family. And really, we're not. And families are also dysfunctional. And so I think this is part of this compliance. What I see is a little bit this, well, they're really mad at us for whatever reason. There's no legal reason necessarily that's behind it. They're mad. Why don't we just give them a little bit more money? My question is, well, that's lovely, impetus, but what's the precedent? So I think we tend to think about precedent. What does that mean for the next? How does this play out across people? How does this play out in the system? And I'm not sure I would necessarily do that if I hadn't been legally trained. And it's not that we don't like people. It's just that I think we're system wide. And so that clearly impacts thinking about risk and things probably flows into every decision we make in some way.
I was actually going to make a comment that's sort of in line with what Nora just said. In some ways, I'm probably just generally risk averse as a personality. Maybe that's what attracted me to law. But on legal issues, I am probably less risk averse than I would otherwise be. And then my colleagues are, and to a certain extent, then my outside general counsel is. Now, I'm always of the view when people would say to me, if you don't do what I want you to do, or I'm really unhappy about X or Y, you better solve it, or else I'm going to take legal action. And my response was, yeah, bring it on. We get sued all the time, no problem. Here's the name and contact information for our attorney. Please direct all future correspondence exclusively to him. Don't be in contact with the faculty or me. And almost always they would back right down. Oh, well, no, let's sure we can work something out. So sometimes the attorney would say, well, the risks of litigation, we were sued periodically. I'm sure everybody is. And generally speaking, if I thought we were in the right, didn't do anything wrong, I wanted to mitigate the case because I didn't want people to see the college as an easy target, as a place where if you make a stink, and people do, we're going to settle just to make it go away. I mentioned our decision to require vaccination. We've got 3 lawsuits still pending. People who didn't get vaccinated and were forced to retire or resign. And I said, I don't want to settle those. We were in the right, and I want to litigate it, and let's go forward. So I think it makes me less risk averse because I've had a lot of experience with it.
Great. Andy, well, have something?
No, I was going to just echo the exact same sentiment that I think not risk adverse, but I think I'm more risk tolerant, and particularly when it comes to litigation. So again, not so veiled threats of litigation are responsive and with bring it on. more often than not. Our institution, I think, particularly with public institutions, you worry about not just the court of law, but court of public opinion, right? And sometimes just the allegation is bad enough. And so being very deliberate in how you respond to threats of litigation. Our institution, for instance, we had a culture of if someone made just the most veiled of complaints, just immediately union representation at the table and $50,000 check was being signed like within a couple of weeks. And so I adopted with our general counsel kind of be a really myopic policy of like there's no such thing as a pay and stay JCU anymore, right? So it's like there are times when people are genuinely aggrieved and you investigate it and you deal with it head on. There's consequences for it, but the shaking the tree, the money tree, to come to an end.
Well, that's a very good example of that, which I'm mindful of. Michelle, I'm sure Patty are. Is when I became a dean, there were all these lawsuits challenging and allegations first that law schools were misrepresenting how potentially would get a job if you went to the institution. There were some bad actors, but basically very broad. Now it took years. Every one of those suits went nowhere, were dismissed as should have been. Still very damaging, and just underscores it's an example of how higher education's got all these different. When you're making a decision on what to do, which you must do, if you're a university president, you've got to make a decision. You've got to consider all these different consequences to the pot in terms of then assessing what you're going to do in response to the risk and to assess what all the risks are. Oh, you're very, by the way, you're a very good question. I think you're standing there out ready to pull the plug, right? Is that it?
No, I'm just waiting.
Waiting for the what? Okay, well, we could have, yeah, we could, but I was just going to point out because you sort of very astute and provocative question. It brought us circle to where we began, or I began on this. So the worst, in my view, the worst kind of lawyers are the ones who say no. They only know how to say no. Instead of here's how. And I like the best law schools and best training for working out and developing those schools and those kind of skills, the kind of people who are chosen presidents. But in assessing risk, there's a large calculation about, best as we can tell, what are the legal consequences, what are the public consequences, what's the cost, what's the internal constraints. Sometimes you might want to just support your people, but also it's an assessment, what's at stake, how much does it matter? And it takes a little bit of courage, sometimes a lot of courage, to make a decision and risk is involved. You can never completely eliminate risk. So what I was talking about the people who took quite a risk, all those lawyers and the others that signed the Declaration of Independence, on a daily basis, academic leaders are making in small and large ways courageous decisions to have consequences. Them personally, how many times have we seen consequences this past 12 months for academic leaders who have made decisions to challenge the public view? So you brought us, your question has really brought us a circle. We really have time? Not, I mean, just because I do it. Is there any questions more out in there? Because I have another question we could ask everybody for. I see out in the audience a lot of APs, aspiring presidents. So if somebody is selected by somebody like the help of extraordinary search firms that are out there, Werner, Atwood, Keeper, Jock, in Washington, Korn Ferry, the great Korn Ferry. The people are qualified, got what it takes, and got what they're qualified. Now they got to get ready to actually take the job. So what advice would you give somebody who's just landed the job? What should they be doing? Get ready to take it, assuming they have all the qualifications. What would you do? Even I've overlooked you, mistaken you, beat you up. Why don't you start off in the other side?
So my first advice would be rethink the decision. No, I'm just kidding. You saw those articles in the New York Times and the, Wall Street Journal. Why would anybody want to be a college president? They're wonderful jobs, that they're challenging, they're stressful jobs. So the advice I always give presidents in transition, you got to learn everything you can about your, it's an obvious thing. You got to learn what you can about your institution. You need to find out all the things that you weren't told in the interview process. You need to meet and really get to know your senior leadership team, because they're critical to your success as a president. You need to be visible. You need to think about how are you going to present yourself and to your community, to your new community. What tone are you going to adopt? What vision are you? Everybody wants to know what your vision. They want to know in the search process, what's your vision? Who knows what your vision is? You barely know the institution. You're supposed to have a thought out vision. So you have to think about how you're going to address that question. You have to think about the communication and marketing side. You have to reach out to board members. There are always influence leaders on the board, key donors. You've got to reach out to all those people and start visiting them. You have to show faculty that you care about what they care about. You have to meet with them as much as you can, and you have to spend time with students. So there's a host of things, but the reality is that the day you step in the door, everything is different. It's not what you expected in some respects, and it's a very steep learning curve. It's the traditional drinking from the fire hose. But as challenging as it is also a wonderful opportunity. You really can shape the direction of an institution. I think provides an incredibly vital service to the country and to society, and as well, of course, to its students. So it's a great thing to be able to do.
Well, it's hard to top that, David. You really. We'll all just endorse and embrace it. Isn't that good? I think that's
I like that. I seldom got that answer at Hamilton, but
I believe the next speaker is Patty. But before she comes up here, I want to take liberty and tell you, put all two quick stories about leadership and other things people think of it. So, my first faculty meeting, a non-traditional background at Brooklyn Law School. I gave what I thought was, to say so myself, an incredible vision speech. Laid it all out, not a note. I mean, it was remarkable. And then I made a fatal mistake. I said, "Are there any questions?" And an arm shoots up, and most of you probably know who I'm talking about. To my horror, I can say it was Professor Aaron Twersky, who's become one of my great friends. And now I'm a little nervous because I know the great Aaron, winner of the Prosser Award for the Giants. And when I was Moynihan's chief of staff, I knew him years before because we had to deal with him because the family and he were so influential in the Hasidic community. And so I was very respectfully, Professor Twersky, it's on your mind. He says, "So Dean, are you a surveyor of there?" Said the rugs on the fourth floor are in terrible condition and probably have to be completely replaced. So now I'm feeling, really confident, and I made a real rookie mistake. I said, "I'm going to take care of that." Thank you, Aaron. You've given me a gift. Little did I know that the hardest thing a leader can do are furnishings and artwork. It's the hardest thing. It's impossible. So I said, "I'm going to get that done." It took like 5 years, right? But I got it done. I said, "But Professor Twersky, just before I get started, I just want to know, have you approached facilities or the repair shop?" He says, "I didn't know I had to go that high." And that in an instant, it taught me everything I needed to know about it. Now, the other thing is, we were just talking about aspiring presidents. And I will tell you, I went through, it was really, process is really something for an academic leadership position. And at least in my experience, you usually have to you make it all the way through all these hoops and hurdles. And the lightning strikes and everything else, you now have to appear before the faculty and the staff and everybody, and you give two speeches. One is your academic, your speech. Somehow I got through that. And the other is your vision speech. In these, there's always these recurring questions. And they're asked so sweetly, but they're not friendly questions. So one of these friendly questions that's always asked, especially for somebody who they put you in a box, non-traditional, which I take as a compliment. Somebody will inevitably ask, so you've been very successful in the private sector, in the government sector. Would you please tell us something that's a key to your success that you feel will be useful to bring to this institution? You can read the thought bubble over their head and say, okay, Mr. Big Shot, hang yourself, right? Because, it's not going to apply. They're not going to like it. So whenever I would get that question, that came up almost every single time. I would respond. I'd look right into them and I would say, thank you for that question. Very first thing I would do on my first day, I would mandate, that's a bad word, right? Like you might as well swear in front of it. I will mandate that each and every one of you start keeping track of your time every day in 10-minute increments. Okay. Most everybody would start laughing because they get the joke, right? And you would win over, I think, most everybody, except for the person who asked the question, But on that note, I think it helps attention on top of everything else to enjoy what you're doing and not to take yourself completely seriously. It's impossible in my case because other people point out I shouldn't be serious about myself. I think that's my word of advice. And I thank you all for this wonderful program, attentive, participating, showing your seriousness in getting it right in leadership. And thank you, Patty Salton, who's now going to take the stage.
I just want to give a series of thank yous and a quick wrap up for today. So first, I'd like to thank all of our incredible speakers, moderators, facilitators from today. They did a lot of work in advance of getting here. The panels met numerous times and it was clear. So I want to thank all of you up here, those of you in the audience who participated earlier in the day. I want to thank the students from the Touro Law Review. I hope that you learned a lot today, and I hope that you each assign yourselves to one or more of the speakers and presenters on their articles, because this is of the Touro Law Review. One of the things that was really apparent from today is there's a lot of changing law and regulation in higher education. It's exciting. And as you were told multiple times, I'm speaking to the students right now, it's a great career to get into, and something that most people, when you go to law school, you don't say, I don't go to law school to be a lawyer in higher education, thinking about other things. When you start to think about all of these rules and regulations, about every subject that you learn in law school, it's really great. It's challenging. But it's also challenging for everybody up on this, because the risk and things that we talked about throughout the day, all of these laws and regulations add to, I'm going to go back to Joyce Jacobson, our former president economist. It all adds up to the cost of higher education. And you're asking what the tuition goes for, and why do we need philanthropy, and why do we need external support? Because it's not just the day-to-day routine things that you see that are expensive, but it's all of the laws and regulations and accreditation requirements. And then, as we heard about today, the things you don't even see, all of the lawsuits and the threatened lawsuits, and how do you manage all of that? It all comes down to the economics and the business of higher education through legal regulation. I want to thank Professor Seplowitz and Dean Citron and Dean Langen for going along with the pitch to the law review to do this as a symposium topic. And I want to thank Dean Citron especially because I know he likes law reviews at law review symposia that look at deceased legal greats. And so this was not that kind of a symposia. And I want to thank the law school for also taking advantage of our new home at 3 Times Square. So many of you may not know in the audience, law school is based in Central Islip on Long Island. This August, they opened up a branch campus here in this building, and we now have a Flex JD program Sunday only in person at 3 Times Square, and the rest is asynchronous. They have a similar program on Long Island. Now we've expanded into another marketplace. I'd also like to thank all our sponsors who are at the bottom here. They made it possible for all of us to be here in a very economical way. So you didn't have to pay for the CLE. The food was subsidized. And most important, shout out to Joyce Jacobson and Lou Gard. This symposium happened because their book came out. And we got on the phone and said, you know, we have to spread the word about this. And I urge you to please, if you didn't grab your copy of this book on the way in, take it on the way home. It's a good read. It's not a hard read. And it's something I think that tells a great story of where we came from, where we are now. And more importantly, everything that we heard today is where we might be heading, in a new administration. Because I kept looking at this topic on this slide that was up here most of today. Like we talked about lawyers a lot. We talked about government at the state level, the federal level. We really didn't get into the local level today. We talked about regulation and policy, its influence on higher education. We didn't really get a chance to talk a lot about academics. And so I go back to the slide that Joyce and Lou put up last night at their keynote, and they showed just that small building that was the building of the college when it first started. And then they talked about the expansion of the administration building, everything else. That small building was the faculty. It was the academics that were leading higher education. Now we're in a very changing landscape with government, public policy, and regulation. Something just to think about how we're all going to continue to navigate, negotiate, and work together as we strengthen the real great goals and ideals of higher education. I want to thank you all for coming. Remember to sign out so you can get your CLE credit, and remember to fill out the evaluation forms. And if you want us to do something like this again, let us know that on the forms too. Thanks very much.